life will always at some point ask of us to move beyond thinking as a child and childish things and moving into deeper self-authorship. That is choosing in a world that has more complexity than we wish it did. Before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to share an exciting announcement. I'm going to be in Alpine, Utah on September 10th, hosting my first ever event specifically for singles. Click the link in the show notes for details and ticket information. The response to our recent Q&A, which we're releasing today, was incredibly positive. And so we've had numerous requests for a live event to dive deeper on the topics of singlehood, navigating sexuality, dating, and creating better relationships than perhaps the ones we've come out of. So whether you've never been married, if you're divorced, widowed, I'm going to be having a grounded conversation on sexuality and chastity as an adult, how to date wisely without repeating old patterns, and what it looks like to use this season as an opportunity for real growth. So we hope to see you on September 10th, and I hope you enjoy the Q&A. Thanks, everyone. Welcome, everybody. We're really glad to be having this conversation tonight on what it is to be single and some of the challenges that you face as Latter-day Saints, confronting a lot of questions around sexuality and being in relationships. I think Christy proposed doing this, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago, and we've just had a lot of interest. So I'm not surprised. The focus of my work has generally been working with married couples, but the population of the church is progressively more single, and these are important and hard questions in a church that is focused on chastity and marriage. So there are way more questions than I have time for tonight, but I think we will continue to work in this space and perhaps even create live events and opportunities to learn together and to meet each other and that kind of thing going forward. And speaking of live events, we do have 2 retreats this fall. Well, actually one in August, the Art of Desire course, which is for women, and it's a sexuality and self-development course. So it's really about being more at peace with your sense of self, with your embodied self, with your desires, sexual and otherwise, and learning how to forge a self in the world, how to be more at peace with yourself as a woman and as a human being. And then similarly, I have the Art of Loving course, which is for men, single or partnered, and really the same idea of how to be more at peace with yourself, how to come to terms with your sexual reality, and how to live in a way that's being true to yourself and integrated with your sexuality. So they're similar courses, just obviously going through some of the traditions, false traditions and otherwise that we've received and how they've maybe interfered with finding more peace in ourselves. So Christy can post about those if you want to learn more about those events and the dates and so on. Okay, so I would say I'm going to cover a few themes tonight, but the theme of chastity, not surprisingly, came up a lot in the questions that were submitted, and the questions regarding chastity would best be summarized as, how do we relate to our belief in chastity when I'm no longer a 20-year-old virgin who's never experienced sex, right? And, now that I'm divorced or have experienced sex, how do I be true to my faith, my sexuality, and my soul in this period, living as a single person or beginning to date again? So as one person wrote, how do you define the law of chastity? It's easy to want to see things as black and white when in a dating relationship, but it seems there's more gray than meets the eye. When am I offending God when getting more physical with a girlfriend or boyfriend? So I think to frame tonight's discussion, or at least this part of it, I think it would be really valuable to think about just the virtue or the ideal of chastity and what is it exactly, is it not, and how might we think about it so that it actually benefits our lives rather than just a simple restriction or rejection of pleasure and sex, as many of us have learned to relate to the idea of chastity. So, in one of my favorite books, The Soul of Sex, Thomas More, who's a Catholic theologian and I believe clinician as well, he talks about chastity not as repression or denial or even moral purity. Instead, he thinks of chastity as a way of giving our sexuality depth and soul. And that's what our goal is. And so he thinks of sexuality as being deeply connected to our souls and therefore inherently spiritual and symbolic, not just biological. Because as you know, if you've followed me and you've heard me talk in a similar way, that sex always involves meaning. And as I write about in my book, That We Might Have Joy, that sexuality, human sexuality always involves, human longing, beauty, intimacy, and mystery. And that's really what makes it erotic or life-giving, right? And so it's deeply tied to our souls and our spirituality, whether or not we want it to be, whether or not we admit that it is, okay? Because it's hard to escape that fact. And so to Thomas More in his book, The Soul of Sex, chastity is not simply avoiding sex, right? It's our endeavor to relate to it carefully and even reverently rather than compulsively. And Adam Miller, some of you may have read some of his books, but he talks about chastity similarly. He's an LDS philosopher. He writes about this in the book, Letters to a Young Mormon. Similarly, that it's not about repression and denial, but more about relating to our sexuality with care. And so it's a way of bringing patience and self-awareness to our sexual lives so that they can be truly erotic, truly life-giving to us. If we go in either extreme, either that is to fully repress it and deny it and to make it this bad thing, then our sexuality controls us still because we're afraid of it. We can't deal with it. Or if we go to the other extreme and we are indulgent or compulsive with it, or we have no inhibition around our sexuality, it also runs us. And in either extreme, it interferes with our peace, with our solace. And so, in order for pleasure to be life-giving, right, then it has to be in a kind of moderation. It has to be related to with care and with wisdom. And this is true around any pleasure. In fact, I write about this in the book that the Epicureans, right, one of several Greek philosophies, were very concerned with the sensual and its ability to feed our spiritual selves, to feed our souls. That if we relate to beauty and sensual pleasure with wisdom and temperance, it actually can fill us with joy, can feed us and give us something to sustain us in a fallen world and in a difficult world. But if we go into the extreme of either repressing it or indulging it, then it actually undermines our spiritual well-being. And I think in our puritanical culture, we tend to think that spirituality and repression of desire go together, that the more we can deny ourselves, right, this kind of endure to the end kind of idea, that maybe then in the next life we'll get our mansion and we'll get we'll get all the things that we're putting off now. And I think there's clearly value to self-restraint, and I'm going to talk more about that. There's clearly value to learning self-control, but if we relate to chastity and our ideas of God and goodness as full repression of pleasure, then it actually can interfere with finding joy in our lives, finding peace with ourselves, because we're trying to deny something that's fundamental to who we are. One of the other points that Thomas More makes that I really like is that he says that erotic energy, okay, again, that means life-giving, because we tend to think of erotic as sort of the pornified versions of sex. But the true meaning of eros and erotic is going back to the Greeks. It's the life energy or the life force. And so how do we relate to the sensual pleasures that we are able to partake in as embodied beings? How do we relate to them in a way that fills us with life, that allows us to have joy and peace and ease in our lives, right? And so I like that Thomas More talks about the fact that erotic energy, right, this life-giving sensual energy should spread throughout our lives as a whole, that we should find that in our friendships, in good food, in nature, in art, in spiritual devotion, and in our home lives, right? Like that this is not just about genital release, okay? That the sensual and sexual can be something that's expressed in many forms and is not indulgent, it's not taking advantage, but it is a way of feeling more alive and more joyful and more at peace with ourselves, like receiving the gifts that God gave us, to take them in, to let them nourish us. And so our souls really need this wholehearted, embodied embrace of the sensual beauty available to us. So this is really one of the core arguments I make in my book, because we are that we might have joy, but I think a lot of us live as though that isn't really true, that long suffering is what God is after, that denial is what proves our virtue. But then we actually rob ourselves of the gifts that God is trying to give us to help us in a difficult world. And again, it's not indulgence, because if we're using sensual pleasure to escape our lives, to be out of connection with our honest selves or with another, that undermines joy. That undermines spiritual peace. But what actually opens us up to the goodness in the world and to God's love and to our worthiness? What allows us to take in the joy that's there for us? You know, a lot of times it's easier to deny it, not see it, not take it in, because it feels safer to us, because we're afraid, or because we're afraid we're not worthy, or because of our entitlement even, we stop seeing the goodness available to us. I remember I was single and I was driving to my internship, and I was in the Boston area, and I remember the leaves were turning and they were perfect. It was like perfection, the brilliance of the leaves, and I could see the water in the distance, and it was just almost it was just amazing. And I remember like I really almost couldn't take it in because I knew it was going to go away. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, because I knew it was temporary, it's almost like I wouldn't take it in fully because I knew there was loss or something that would come. And so it was just a moment, but I feel like a lot of times we relate to the goodness around us that way because we have loss, because we have suffering, because we have uncertainty, that in some ways we don't take in the goodness that's available to us as a gift, as a moment to cherish, to lean into, to experience the awe and wonder of it and let it nourish us for even a moment. And so living in that duality of both suffering and beauty, goodness, darkness and light, love and loss, those things always go together. And the more that we can take in the grace that's available to us through our embodied selves, the more fully we can live. And I really think that's what chastity in its core is about. And I love Thomas More's treatment of this. And I think other philosophers, again, Adam Miller does, and I think C.S. Lewis talks about, so I can't remember all the people that I read around this idea, but I really feel that chastity is not about repression. It's about being able to take in the goodness that we need. And strangely, maybe paradoxically, there's a certain amount of self-control that allows us to forge and create something and receive a deeper level of beauty in our lives. Those two go together, but they require a certain wisdom and faith, in a sense, to be able to find it, even faith in our own worthiness to receive that goodness. Okay, let's see. So, a healthy erotic life, whether in marriage or single, needs restraint. It needs distance and even incompleteness because this restraint drives longing. Okay, this is a little bit of a complex idea, but one that I love. It drives longing, and longing is so fundamental to the erotic. It's so fundamental to Eros. We can have a conversation fully about that on another Facebook Live because it's just a much bigger topic. But Eros is about this, longing for connection, longing for more, longing for mystery, longing for what lies outside of us. And even in marriage, even in a sexual relationship, keeping that energy there, even the longing between, uh, committed partners is really fundamental to this life source and to the beauty of our sexuality. So you can exhaust the erotic and this essential hunger that's a part of the spirituality of Eros through constant gratification and certainly through constant repression. So again, chastity is a way to contain erotic energy so that sex can be soulful rather than merely indulgent or impulsive. And I think that this is again true in marriage. I'm often teaching couples that I'm working with to actually engage more restraint in their sexual relationship, more time to be present with one another, to feel longing with one another, rather than rushing to gratification, rushing to intercourse or consummation, because that's actually a way of getting out of this essential energy that's so important for bonding us to one another, for finding more depth with one another and through our sexual selves. So the paradox is in order to find the spirituality of our sexuality, we need to embrace, in different contexts and so on, celibacy, fidelity, modesty, and even self-control, because those things enhance the meaning of our sexuality. So these are practices that can deepen Eros rather than deny Eros. And that's what we want. Lots of philosophers have talked about this, but I write about this in my book about the fact that Eros is a spiritual energy. And it's a very important one and very, very much connected to joy, whether single or partnered.
Someone said, how do you see this applying to single people without a partner? Longing for what? Longing can become curdling.
Okay, let me think about that. I mean, I would say I suppose longing with resentment can certainly, like longing and a sadness for what you don't have can maybe be curdling. But I think it's not just longing for partnership. It's the kind of earnest pursuit of what is mysterious, what is beautiful, what is outside of our current understanding. It's the longing for anything we have passion for is driven by this Eros energy. It's an energy that is expansive by definition. And certainly romantic love is one expression of Eros, but it's not the only way that we engage in the world erotically. So, as I often tease Christy that she lives very erotically, and I'm like, just ask her husband, right? Okay. Which is to say that Christy has a way of relating to her life with a lot of appreciation and celebration for what is right in front of her. And she does it very, very well and in a way that many of us are numb to or don't take the time to see. So she just lives with a lot of gratitude and she's really taking in the wonder and the amazement of her life. And, it's a gift of Christie's because she just being with her is to kind of, she's waking me up to what's right in front of me often. We often teach down in St. George, and it's just like she's seeing the skies and the stars and dragging me out at 11 at night to appreciate them with her and things like that. And, but it's important because she's awake not just in a kind of resentment about, we all have losses and disappointments and things that we don't have, as Louis C.K. says in a comedy skit, that you can resent that your flight is delayed an hour, or you can be amazed that you get to participate in the miracle of human flight, right? And that we have those choices in our life because it's being able to perceive, see, and take part in the beauty that's there. That's what Eros is. Eros is also to grow beyond our current selves, to leave the self that we know, to expand into something greater than ourselves. And it's a kind of faith. So I won't spend a lot more time on this idea, but it's about growing beyond the self that we currently are. Romantic love is pulling us in this same way. Erotic sex is pulling us in this same way. But it doesn't mean that every longing, that the thing that's hard about longing is that not everything we long for can or will be gratified or offered to us. And so human yearning is part of what it is to be alive. It's a willingness to desire. It's a willingness to move beyond the self we know, even in the face of disappointment and loss. This person says the law of chastity seemed pretty black and white before getting married and was pretty easy to live. After being sexually active in a marriage for 2 decades and now being single again, the struggle is real, especially after reaching the kissing stage in a relationship. There seems to be a lot more gray area now. Where should the line be drawn to still hold good standing before God and the church? Is the line different now than when we were virgins and merely hugging an attractive woman was stimulating? Okay. And then here's another. I'm just going to read the second one because they're similar and I'll answer them both. I'm newly divorced, a 45-year-old female, married for 24 years and interested in dating. How do I navigate chastity? The line of what is chaste has to be different than when I was 20. How do I make the decision for myself and also experiment? I want to keep my spirituality and my sexuality, and I don't want to rush any relationship into another marriage just for sex. Yes, very smart. Help me navigate keeping my sexuality and spirituality while dating. So the first thing I'd say is, in my view, it's unquestionably different than when you're 20 years old. We don't give guidance beyond the For the Strength of Youth manual usually. And so we want the fantasy that it's the same when clearly it's not. And, especially considering Thomas More's perspective, you're not who you were at 20 years old, and the depth of your relationships are not the same either. And your dependency on the church or authority is probably not the same either. And likely, nor should it continue to be, right? Because when you were in your adolescence and young adulthood, I think you likely benefited from rules and safeguards at a different level than you need now to figure out what is actually true to the spirit of the law. What is actually helping you to navigate this part of being human in a way that is true to your soul, true to another, right? And opening you up to the beauty in life. And so that's not to say that chastity and restraint doesn't matter for your soul, right? It does, but there's more responsibility on you, I think, to figure out what that means to the well-being of your soul, to your ability, because I think it means as an adult, you're no longer a child. How do I, as an adult, choose in a way that's wise and honest and self-authoring, not dependent on someone else to tell me or to tell us the precise way to navigate this wisely? I think that this is hard for us because I'm not going to be here to say, here is the right answer for you. I just think there's a deeper transfer of responsibility to determine how to be true to the spirit of what you're trying to create. Restraint will very likely be a part of it. Okay. But it's not so much in the way you did it as a younger person, very likely, which had more fear in it, more external trust, more safeguards to help you move into transition into adulthood, right? Without doing harm. And now, as a wiser person and trying to navigate a relationship as an adult, it's probably going to ask you to take deeper responsibility for how you find what's being true to your soul and true to another and navigating an adult relationship. So I don't have the answer, nor should I try to give you the answer, but more to say more responsibility is on you to determine what that means for you. I think that, a lot of times we want to be complicit in a kind of dependency that interferes with us growing into a deeper form of adulthood, a deeper form of really taking responsibility for our lives and for determining what is wise and good. Okay, so this is a similar question, but let me just say, so this person says, I'm really trying to put into practice the idea of accepting and integrating my sexuality as a valuable and positive part of my life to replace the cultural approach I learned growing up of denying or running away from sexual things. However, I'm currently separated, about to be divorced, and all of the ideas I have about positive expressions of sex are in the context of sexual relations in marriage, which is pretty far away from my reality right now. I'm having trouble coming up with things I can do to actively affirm my sexuality that don't run contrary to my values. Any suggestions on how to learn or develop a new culture of proactive integration of my sexuality as a positive and important part of my life during this phase? So, I have a couple of thoughts about it. So, first of all, I think an important part of sexual integration is accepting the fact of arousal and desire, right? Even if you're an adolescent, accepting the fact of those feelings as being fundamental to being human, given to us by God, and not something to be afraid of. In fact, the more fear we have around arousal and desire, and the more unwilling we are to acknowledge it or understand it, the more we struggle to actually integrate it. So that is to say, if we are either rushing to deny it and repress it out of fear or running to indulge it, right, the less we're able to be in a wise relationship with it. It's in many ways getting more comfortable with fear, getting more comfortable with arousal and desire, like tolerating the emotions that come over us that we feel, and allowing them to teach us something about ourselves, but not be run by our emotions and our desires. Being able to see them, notice them, understand them about ourselves, and make choices in line with our values. And so that, I think even people in marriage, I have found, struggle with that a lot. Like they feel desire and they have a hard time settling down in the face of desire and even letting the desire and the arousal nourish their souls. In tantric practice, which is an Eastern philosophy that teaches its practitioners to relate to arousal and desire as a spiritual energy, and one to actually nourish and learn to get more comfortable with, because it wakes you up to your life. It wakes you up to the world, that you actually see other people and the beauty and the wonder of the life you're living more fully when you let yourself enjoy that energy, that life-giving energy. And so in the tantric approach, it's that you harnessing that energy, not seeing it as, I think we're so often taught to be afraid of it, that it's Satan's pathway, it's going to come and get us, that it's a hindrance to our spirituality. God gave it to us, but it's a hindrance, right? Like sex is a horrible thing, so save it for the one you love idea. We see it as a threat, and that does not serve us. Now, of course, we can relate to sexuality in ways that are destructive to another person or even to ourselves, right? If we betray ourselves through our sexuality or we betray another person through our sexuality, that can be very destructive. But arousal and desire is a form of being awake and noticing the sensual world that we live in. And so letting it take care of us, letting it make us feel more alive, accepting the fact of it, and learning to be awake to this part of being human and sitting with desire enough to make choices that we can stand by with our desire, which is going to put you as a single person up against hard choices. I mean, I think it does even as a married person, to be honest. I think a lot of times we think that the married people are just having lots of sex and it's all going well. And that's simply not true. Of course, most married people are in a different situation in terms of having sex be a possibility in a way that single people often are not. But it's still the same challenge of learning how to sort out who am I going to be? What choices am I going to make? And can I stand by the losses that those choices include? And they always have losses. Okay. So I can either choose, well, I should say they always have uncertainty at least that go with them. So what really matters to me? What do I really value? And so if I value, let's say I value not having sex before marriage, or I value not masturbating, if that's your value, then it's important to own it and claim it as your own value, as yours, not as one that's been dictated to you externally. Now, maybe you learned it externally, but it is your value. It is one that you claim and that matters to you. When I was doing my dissertation research, there were women who, I was asking them about their premarital experiences. These were all married women who'd grown up in the church. And so I interviewed them about their premarital experiences around sex and then their experiences in marriage. And there were real differences in how the women who, I'm trying to give an easy response, how do I make these groups? But one group that had low levels of agency and sexual integration, and women who had higher levels of agency and sexual integration. The women with lower levels of agency and sexual integration tended to relate to sexual feelings with fear and shame. Okay, so they were afraid of sexual feelings. And then even if they chose not to masturbate, for example, but it was an external reference because God would be displeased, my bishop would be displeased, my future husband would not value me. That kind of focus for the decision, first of all, made them lower on compliance with that ideal, actually, and also made it much more about feeling controlled from the outside, not about them determining a self in the world. There were other women that I interviewed who chose not to masturbate, not because they saw sex as a bad thing. In fact, the integrated group had a much more positive response to knowing their body was capable of desire and arousal. That group saw it as a good thing, even as a young person. They saw it as a kind of exciting thing. But they also wanted to hold on to it for marriage. They received the message of the law of chastity, but they saw it as something that would serve their interests, that was aligned with what they desired in their lives. So even though they were engaging in a kind of self-denial, okay, it wasn't an externally driven one as much as it was a sort of self-authored decision. So they obviously were making this decision in a context of having received this ideal and this idea, but they took it on as their own. They wanted it. They wanted to preserve sex until marriage. They wanted a sexual relationship where they would bring their full sexuality in the context of a commitment. And so because it reflected who they were, that while there was restraint in it, it wasn't a kind of repressive restraint. It wasn't a self-denying in the kind of core sense that I think some of the low integration people felt. And so that's why I'm saying to you, it has to come from the question of who do I desire to be? What do I believe? What do I value? What do I want my life to be about? Where do I want to stand? And I'm up against hard choices. If you make that about a fear-driven, I need to comply or to earn love, to get God to be happy with me, you're going to feel deeply conflicted and kind of tortured by these questions. And no one's going to have the answer for you. The more that you can determine what path am I going to claim? What do I think is being true to what I believe, to my own well-being, and to the well-being of anybody that I'm dating or partnered with or about to partner with? What will actually help us thrive? What is the meaning of our interaction or our engagement of our sexuality? Or if you're not dating, of my own engagement with my own sexual and sensual self? What is it creating in my life? Is it opening me up to my life and to joy? Am I using the sensual aspects of my life to step more deeply into my life? Or am I using it to escape my life? And I think it can be very different. Okay, so some people use self-pleasure to escape their lives, to numb out. Other people may use it to accept their sexuality and to step deeply into their lives at the same time, to live more fully in their lives. Those are personal decisions and ones where we maybe want to have somebody tell us the right way to be or what is the best way. And we can certainly learn from other people's experiences. But ultimately, we have to self-determine, which is one of the hardest things of adulthood and of spiritual development. And this is one other thing I would just say is that I think if you relate to sex as a way to escape yourself and your conscience, right, it's going to impact how you're in a partnership. If you relate to your sensual and sexual self to be more deeply in your life and more connected to your soul and who you are, it's going to help you in a future relationship. So sex isn't good or bad per se. It's how am I relating to it and what is it creating in my life? I could give you examples in both directions. People who used the choice to not masturbate, I'm just going to stick with this particular thing, in a way that shut them down, okay, because they had so much fear of it. I had a client who, I actually write about this in the book. He had so much fear of arousal and desire. And he took like the For the Strength of Youth manual that was, written in 2011. It's now evolved, but it so seriously that he wouldn't do anything that aroused sexual feelings because he saw that as the threat. But he had a kind of OCD, scrupulosity is what I'm trying to say. And so he took it very, very seriously. And he didn't even date because when he went out with women, he had sexual feelings emerge. Okay, so he chose not to masturbate, but it was so fear driven that it was actually disrupting his development, disrupting his ability to move more deeply into life because it was so perfectionistic and fear driven, right? As opposed to one of the women that I interviewed in my dissertation research, where she chose not to because she wanted to conserve it for another context. And so it was about a life-giving decision. It was about, I want to wait because this means something to me, not because I reject my sexuality, but because I want to build the longing into my life and wait for another time. So both ostensibly are obeying a recommendation, okay, but one is life destroying and one is life giving. Same with the choice to self pleasure. One can do it in a way to escape life, to basically numb out from life as a way to kind of move into a kind of retreat into oneself and out of engagement in relationships. And one could choose to do it as a way of caring about oneself, accepting oneself and one's body, and in a way that allows them to accept their sexuality more fully. So it's really, what am I creating and what can my soul stand by? Right. If I were to imagine meeting God, what could I stand by within myself? Okay, so this person, he says, how can I, as a single person, reconcile developing my sexual self with the law of chastity? And how do I know where the line is? So I've been naming that about this taking more responsibility. And then she says, what do I do if a future partner or church leader thinks that what I've decided is not in line with the gospel? I want to follow Christ and I want to learn to love myself. So again, this is not what we often say in the church, but I think it's really important that as an adult, we don't stay in a fully dependent position on church leaders to tell us who to be and what is right. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Church leaders are there to support us in our relationship with God and with Christ, not the other way around. Okay, so they are there to support us in this process of discerning who we are, how to be true to ourselves, how to say, how do these commandments and principles and ideas apply to me? Where is my agency in this? And this is really, we need often the dependency when we're younger. It helps us. We're borrowing wisdom, we're borrowing those guidelines and those safeguards, and they can be protective and helpful for us to forge more self-control and more self-regulation as we're maturing. But at a certain point, what development asks of us is to engage our agency more fully in the face of complexity or competing values, competing ideals, to self-determine. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is very much a story of moral development that happens when you have competing desires, competing expectations. And how do you choose, how do you engage agency in a way to self determine? And I think we want a world in which we have easy answers, or we know here's the rules, and as long as I obey them, everything will work out right. And I think many single adults know better than ever that that's just not true. That you can live your life very obediently or very conscientiously and still confront disappointment, loss, complexity. And life will always at some point ask of us to move beyond thinking as a child and childish things and moving into deeper self authorship. That is choosing in a world that has more complexity than we wish it did, often, that asks our own discernment, that asks us to determine genuinely what is good. Now, people often don't like this idea because they're afraid what it means is I get to make the rules now because I'm an adult. And so I don't care what anybody says. And it isn't that. And I write about this a lot in the book, that stage 3 is not about rebelling. It's not about self-indulgence. It's a deeper integration of what we've inherited in this, in the earlier stages of our development. But we're now moving from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. And that asks us to bring our conscience and our discernment and our courage into our lives to be co-creators of what is good with God. That's what the church is there to help us to get to. But a lot of times we prefer to stay dependent in a way that doesn't create more goodness. It's more of an act of fear to stay dependent than it is an act of faith and virtue. And so I think a lot of times in the complexity of being an adult and single and navigating a dating relationship, for example, or sexuality as a single person, asks us to self-determine and to take deeper responsibility for how we are in relationship to our sexuality and whether or not the way we're choosing is forging more goodness in our life or not. Okay, so this is now more a little bit about relationships and creating better relationships. This person asks, you've talked before about how being able to self-confront is the most important quality you would tell your own kids to look out for in a romantic partner. What kind of behaviors indicate that a person is willing and able to do this? What does it look like in action? What it looks like in action is if you're bringing up something, first of all, that you're willing to be self-honest enough to acknowledge where you are a part of a problem in a dynamic. Okay, that you yourself can do this, that you're willing to really truly look at yourself honestly and how you may be impacting another person, right? Whether or not you intended to or consciously thought it and so on. If you're doing something that actually is interfering with someone that you're dating with, or, that it's actually having a negative effect, and your own willingness is very important, but so is theirs, of course. And so, is the person you're dating always defensive? Are you always defensive? I don't mean this just for you. I want you to say everything I'm saying, that you apply it to yourself as well. When you hear negative feedback, when they hear negative feedback, are they defensive? Do they spend their whole time saying, okay, maybe I did it, but here are all the reasons why it was justified, right? Do they say they're sorry, but not do anything differently? Okay, because the real thing is, do they honestly look at what you're saying and own anything that is theirs to own? Now, it's a pretty high bar, I suppose. But even if you both do it not very well, but you still do it, well, the partnership has a fighting chance. Okay. But if you're with somebody who will twist away from any culpability or awareness of sin, okay, well, then that means it will be very hard for the marriage to grow. So you want to look for, do they come toward the problem? Do they bring their honesty to it, even if they see it differently? Not defensiveness, honesty. Are they bringing their perspective to truly understand and be understood? Or are they bringing their perspective to basically deny and get away from any truth in what you're saying? That's what I would look for. So I think you can tell when you're with somebody, who cares about you and cares about doing right by you, because you'll feel it in their response, even if they see things differently than you. You feel that they're not just trying to defend their ego. That's not the only goal in the communication. They care about your experience, right? Even if it challenges theirs. Okay. This person asks, how important is feeling seen and understood by your partner in dating? Is seeking the feeling of being seen and understood the same as seeking validation? And how might it be problematic? So I think the question is, do you feel that you can be yourself with this person? Or do you feel like you have to hide on some level who you are? Are you performing a self, or are you being yourself? Do they want to know you, right? Do they really want to know you? Do they want to understand you? That's different than validating you or saying they agree with everything you think or they see the world the same way, but they're open to really knowing you and they can handle knowing you, even if they see things differently. And importantly, do you want to know them? Right? Do you have a yearning to know them as they are? Not just in as much as they validate you or make you feel good. And so, needing them to make everything okay about you is a dependency on validation, right? Needing them to reassure you, needing them to make you feel seen at all times. That's dependency. But I do think it's important to feel like you can be yourself and you feel an honest acceptance there. So, let me just give an example from when I was dating John. I often did not feel validated by John. That is to say, John was much quieter. He certainly wasn't very expressive or effusive. He could be absent-minded and distracted. And in my insecurity, I would often project onto that rejection and a feeling of not feeling seen, or known by him. Now, I dated him for almost 3 years. Well, really, it was 3 years by the time we got married. But in the midst of me kind of grappling with that question, when I was really honest with myself, the reality was I knew that he really did know me and he really did care about me, even though there were gaps, certainly around validation. Okay, so he could be absent minded, right? I remember once I was supposed to meet him somewhere to get keys from him or something, and he just was in the midst of work, deeply involved in it, and totally spaced the time of everything. And this was before cell phones where I could just call him and say, "Hey, I'm over here," you know. And so I'm standing there waiting for him. He's not coming. And, my needy, reflected sense of self was just like, this person doesn't care about me enough, or has forgotten about me, and I just was in some fear and reactivity to it. But the thing was, it's just that John engaged in the world differently than I did. And it's also conceivable that I could do that in another moment. It's just that because it sort of punctured my sense of being all important to him, then I felt anxious about that. And it required me to handle my sense of self. But when it really came down to it, the truth of it was there was a ton of data to support that this person who engaged in the world differently than me truly cared about me, truly wanted to know me, did understand me, did value me. He just wasn't there to prop me up and validate me at all times and in all ways. And if he'd been the right kind of person, he would have. No, just kidding. Okay, so I just was regressing to my younger self. Okay, and so that's the core issue. And so it asks of us to sustain ourselves. To love another person is on some level to sustain ourselves because they're not going to be there at every moment and in every way. But I still knew that he knew me and loved me and chose me. That was the truth of it. However imperfectly, that was the core reality. And that's what matters. But it will always ask us to handle ourselves in the aloneness that's a part of any relationship, which is different than loneliness. Loneliness is I need you, or you can't or won't know me. Aloneness is you are different than me and I won't punish you for that. Okay, let me take one more before we stop. How do you suggest approaching or figuring out the topic of sexual compatibility? Nearly every non-sexually active single person I've ever met has this concern. Yeah, I think a lot of people do have that concern. And I would say engaging enough, right, to feel how easy is it to be with each other? How much guard, fear, anxiety exists between you, right? Is there a kind of surrender or freedom or longing in the energy between you? So that's important. I remember John saying to me, we dated for about 3 months before we ever touched each other. And then when we hugged each other, he said, months later, he said to me, that hug was remarkable to me. I was like, remarkable? And he's like, it was remarkable to me because you melted into me. And I'd never experienced that before. And I think the reason that I did melt into him, okay, for all of my anxiety and so on, is I knew this is a person I could be myself with, that I could let down my guard with them, that I could truly be with him and still be myself. Okay. And it was expressing itself physically, even in a hug, even in the first time I touched him. Because what I think a lot of people do in marriage and in dating is they are making out or they are trying to have sex, and they're moving into a behavior, but they're using the behavior to get away with what's not resonating and happening between them. And so they're moving too quickly to kind of get away from what they aren't feeling with one another. And this is to the point that I think Thomas More was making, that the Epicureans and the tantric philosophers are saying, is that there is an energetic exchange that's really important and that you can feel on some level, that isn't about intercourse. It's about an energy that you can experience with one another body to body, physically, that exists even when your bodies separate. Okay, that you feel some desire and energy for one another. I think that's important energy in a good marriage. Now, context changes because even if people feel that they have it when they're dating, when you get married, because the meaning changes, for a lot of people, then the energy changes. And the reason is they go from a sense of freedom in pre-dating sometimes to a sense of obligation in marriage. And as soon as as I talk about in my Sex Worth Wanting course, when the meaning turns from freedom and the ability to be oneself into obligation and pretense, eros will go down always. So that is okay in the sense that eros in the beginning matters, because even if we have to learn how to grow back into it, how to sustain it, how to grow into people that can truly accept each other and make room for each other, which is a core energetic reality of good eros. It's valuable to have it in the beginning. It's valuable to know that you feel it with one another if you want to recreate it later or know that you can find it again. Okay, let me just quickly. This person says, how do I bring up porn while I'm dating? And how will I know if he's answering honestly about his porn use? So I might ask, can you tell me what your relationship to porn has been throughout your life? When did you first see it? Right? How did you respond to it when you did? How do you think about it? And you just want to look at how honest and thoughtful the response is, right? How forthcoming, how willing to be known, and how willing are you to know the answer, right? How willing are you to understand who they are and how they relate to their sexuality and to pornography? Because the calmer you are, and by calm, I don't mean fake calm. I mean, like, I do want to know you and how you think and how you understand this, because it will allow you to figure out how much integration there is in the person you're dating. How self-honest are they? How revealing are they? How willing are they to be understood and known in this way? It's very, very important indicator of how integrated their sexuality is. I remember a couple came to me and he'd had a lot of compulsive sexual behavior several years before, gone through a church court. They were married, and she just struggled with trust, quote unquote, for years after, feeling like she had a problem because he had obviously overcome these things because he'd been rebaptized and so on. And he was like in a church leadership position and so on. And so when they came in, I just started asking him questions about, well, tell me, how did you overcome this compulsive relationship to sexuality? Tell me the story. Okay, well, the story was very, very thin. I'm not sure how to say it any better, but it didn't have, you didn't have the sense of a person really telling you about a process that they went through. And so I asked another question, like, I really was trying to find, is there a there? Is there something that, some kind of change of heart or shift or maturation that's been a part of this person's experience? Well, it wasn't there, and the story was falling apart just by, and I wasn't interrogating, I was just trying to really get at what was true. And so his story started to fall apart in front of his wife, and I think my point is she was shocked because she couldn't understand how she hadn't been able to see the truth, basically. But I think what she came to understand was her own anxiety in actually knowing and being able to settle down and to see what was there or what wasn't there. So sometimes the more we can kind of just say, can you show me who you are on this? Tell me the story of this. Who are you relative to this? And I don't mean as an interrogation, but as a way to know them. I think you can feel if there's substance there or if there's some level of pretense. Okay. I'm just going to do one more, then I'll be done. Okay. This person says, what are some risks and benefits for a man, if he marries a woman he's not strongly attracted to physically, but she's a wonderful friend and companion. Okay, so I think there are a lot of ways to get married, and there's a lot of people that have gotten married for pragmatic reasons, not romantic reasons. Our romantic ideal is a more modern one. I mean, in the sense that people have gotten married to join families, to join kingdoms, to survive on the frontier. They have learned to love each other in arranged marriages, right? So modern marriage is really driven by choice and desire. And I think there are many good things that can happen in a marriage that is not defined by desire, not defined by attraction. The challenge, in my view, though, is the assumption that it is when it isn't. You know, it's one thing if you're like, we understand this is an arranged marriage. And first of all, one of my professors who was from Iran said, you know, first of all, arranged marriages are not as devoid of choice as one would think. Like sons and daughters are telling their parents, that guy, that one over there, you know, that's the guy I want to be with. So there's a lot more desire than sometimes meets the eye, even if the parents are making the arrangement. And he said for Western marriages, you know, they're more arranged than it meets the eye. That is to say, when you're dating someone, you're very much looking at your parents to say, do you like this person? How does your family feel about this person? And so, you know, he said, even though the kind of focal point is a little different in each culture, that oftentimes, you know, it's more driven by families and choice in some, you know, on some level in both situations. Okay. But that aside, so the challenge in my view is if one thinks this is driven by desire and it isn't. And so when it's really painful is if one person masks that they're not that attracted, marries the person anyway who is attracted, because it's no secret. It is felt. My husband is not attracted to me. My husband is not into me, doesn't feel excited by me, doesn't light up when I enter the room, you know, doesn't crave being close to me. That kind of thing hurts a lot. And so to marry somebody, but to hide that you're not very attracted, I think that's really a problem. And I've seen the aftermath of that in a lot of situations. I would also say, though, sometimes I've worked with couples where they consciously chose this, you know, for example, mixed orientation marriages, where the person that was attracted to the same sex said, listen, I'm attracted. Well, I have two examples in my mind right now. But in one case, you know, she said, I'm attracted to women, but I want to be married and I want to have children. And that's really the life I want. And he said, okay, like we're such good friends and I have so much respect for you. And I actually know another situation where it was a man who was attracted to men. And she said, okay, like we're such good friends and we can do this. In both of these situations, it was the heterosexual person that ultimately left the marriage. And the reason that they did is that it was painful for them to never feel desired. It wasn't that they didn't desire their spouse who was also attracted to the same sex. It's that they never felt truly desired. And that was a much bigger cost on their sense of self than they had anticipated at getting married. So I'm not here to say that people can't make good marriages and create arrangements that don't have much to do with desire and sex. But I think in the way that most of us have grown up and what we anticipate is we want that sense that I choose you and you choose me, that I want to bring my sexuality to you, that I choose to bring it to you and you to me, because it's a way of saying you are special to me. You know, I'm not here to say I know that you couldn't have a good marriage, but I would be careful with it. And I think especially when we've grown up learning sometimes that sex is not that important, it's not a big deal. I'm afraid that that misleads people a bit because I work with so many couples that married in that assumption and then have a lot of loss and pain connected to it. So I would be careful of that. Okay, one last one. Okay. What is true intimacy, and can dating couples have true intimacy without sex being involved? So, just my last thoughts about that. So, first of all, true intimacy. I don't know why people put true before intimacy. Doesn't matter. It's just like a bit. Okay. So, what I think of intimacy is knowing and being known. Okay. And I don't think anybody in the dating stage fully knows and is known. Okay. So there can be, you can feel that sense that I can be myself with you. I desire to create a life with you, but there's still a lot to be known. There's still a lot to explore. You don't even know yourself yet, right? There is so much there's so much terrain that you are going to cover through having children or not being able to have children or confronting economic challenges or positive good things happening in your life. There's so much that you are going to do together, and including sexuality. Like there's a certain amount of knowing each other physically when you're dating, but you can very well preserve elements of that, you know, like how far you go sexually while you're dating, and saving some of the level of that intimacy and exploration and exposure for marriage, and still just have that be part of this growing journey together. My husband and I, we dated for a long time, but we did make a decision like it mattered to both of us to save sex intercourse for marriage, to not, obviously we just did it in a Latter-day Saint way, even though we were older, but that it mattered to us, is what we wanted. We wanted to get married before we lived together and before we shared a name and all those things. And so, but that wasn't because it was chosen. It was like, we're conserving this for a deeper, overt commitment to each other. But because it was chosen, it was still like, I'm not sure how to say it. It's like we're just safeguarding a certain element for a context that mattered to us. But it wasn't about pretending or hiding or deceiving or shielding. That's what interferes. So, how honest are you? How forthcoming? How much do you reveal who you are? Are you choosing another person, or are you using another person, even in getting married? Those are the things that have a short half-life, that actually undermine the marriage later, but not about the limits of how much you know, because there's only so much one can know, and you can consciously choose to have deeper levels of knowing be conserved for a deeper level of commitment. Okay, I think that's it. So, Christy, any questions that feel important?
Well, yes, there's like 57 questions.
I'm sure there are.
What kind of question is that?
Sure, you're like, none of them are important.
Yeah, they were all horrible, horrible questions. No, I have a question that's important. What's one last thing you would say to the mid-singles out there? One important thing they should walk away with?
Okay, good. So let me think just about what would be the thing to say. Well, this is what I would say. I think when we hold an ideal in the church that our lives don't imitate, it can be very painful, disillusioning, a lot of loss, and potentially self-judgment. Why did my story not play out the way it was supposed to, quote unquote, that idea? And imagine that it's somehow our personal failure. And I think that what I think is really true is that a lot of times when we have to confront losses and grief and our lives not going the way we planned, we can either curse God and die, or we can find how to move more deeply into what is true, what is important. We can often learn to be more deeply ourselves through the lessons we learn, through what life didn't offer, what didn't work out as we imagined. Because it's often when we bump up against the hard things that we find something stronger in ourselves. We find more ability to be true to ourselves. And whether or not we engage in another marriage, right, or a marriage for the first time, we can find a way to be truer to ourselves and bring what our strengths are, what our gifts are more fully. So loss is hard, and a lot of times we just see it as failure, but it's often the gift in it is more freedom to find what really matters, what is really true about ourselves, and more able to bless our own lives and those around us through it. And because we idealize marriage so much, and I have nothing against the beauty and gifts in marriage, okay? But there are so many ways to bring our gifts to the world, to love the world, to serve the world, and to be stronger for it. So I think my wish is just that those that are single can find ways to step more deeply into their gifts and who they are without apology. So that's my closing idea.
Thank you so much. That was so helpful. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, we ask that you please rate, review, and share the podcast so that more people can find and benefit from Dr. Jennifer's work.